a chance for the Trustable Credit team, so a team that was kind of working on these ideas that Simon's just discussed in terms of the data log project from the Scottish Nature Finance Pioneers. We were working on this last year, and that was really a kind of early stage of thinking about what issues were coming up in terms of when people were beginning to use digital data to measure biodiversity or to measure nature improvements. And the work that Trustable Credit did last year was 3 working groups that came together to basically underline our thesis that cheap digital devices such as camera traps are good and easy to deploy in sites by people in jobs such as ranger jobs or site manager jobs, or perhaps a farmer themselves. But there is an issue with that data in terms of how the finance sector views it, and that's important if the finance sector are coming to buy carbon credits or biodiversity credits, as they might turn out this year. So the project kind of verified the research questions, and I managed to get some money off Scottish Government to do a further project to enable us to create some standardized processes for Internet of Things sensors or digital measurement devices like camera traps. So what we're trying to do here is sort of say, well, what do these devices on the ground give us? They give us ground truth. They give us data that is considered ground truth, perhaps that triangulates with some data that might come from a satellite. Perhaps it proves what we might have said in a model from a spreadsheet. So the team just now kind of taking over the original Trustable Credit work is now called Trustable IoT, and it's a collaboration between SRUC, SAOS, and John Gillies, an expert in cybersecurity, particularly relating to Internet of Things devices. We are testing the standardized processes, and we'll share them with this group later on, but I'll just build up the context first. And the locations that we are currently testing the processes at are SRUC's Hill and Mountain Research Centre, and the farms there, Davy McCracken and John Holland on the call from there. And the SAOS demo farms in the northeast of Scotland, Paul Crooks and George Noble here from there. And then Lauriston Farm in Edinburgh, and that's where this picture, no, that's where the next picture is taken from. I'll show you that shortly. And Jamie's on the call from there. And then just most recently, Nick Littlewood from SRUC and I had a field trip at RSPB's new Glen Crippersdale reserve and deployed devices there using the steps in the standardized process that we've created for IoT and digital measurement devices. So yeah, just to acknowledge the Trustable Credit Working Group of last year, where we agreed that the cheap and practical sensors were good, but that they needed to be able to show that they were trustable. They needed to be able to show the metadata that they'd been calibrated properly, that they were cyber secure, that they'd been authenticated as a device into a data store. So here we are at Lauriston Farm, and this is the work that we've done since we got the money in July. We've spent the summer drafting the standardised processes. John and the team from SAOS and SRUC been working on that over the summer. We're now coming to this wider working group for your comments and ideas, and then been really testing the processes to see whether you can actually do it on a rainy day in a bit of Scotland's rainforest, and then bringing that practical feedback back into the project to enable us to iterate and improve the processes that we are proposing. The next stage in December is to publish them. So we'll work with Mark Lawson from SRUC to do that, to make an online publication for us all to then be able to use and test more widely. And then as a wider group, test those processes between January and March and communicate them out. So the first test that we did was at SRUC's Hill and Mountain Research Centre. Thanks to Davey for this image that shows where the different IoT sensors are, and there's a weather station there as well. These sensors have been deployed by what we're now calling a third party or an IoT consultancy. They've provided a pack of sensors, and then John Holland and Davey there have also deployed other sensors. But their system is kind of mainly packs of sensors that have been deployed for them. At the RSP reserve, we've very much deployed the sensors ourselves. So that was Nick and I working with RSPB team, Izzy and Lucy. I've managed to converge those brilliant names together there. So Izzy and Lucy came along and helped with that deployment. We didn't deploy smaller mammal traps at RSPB Glen Cribbersdale, but Jamie's done that at Lauriston Farm. And these are sort of adapted boxes which have camera traps inside to enable smaller mammals to come off and be captured by the camera traps. In all of the locations, we've deployed acoustic recorders of different manufacture. And of course, the idea behind these standardized processes is that they're manufacturer agnostic, which enables the cheaper options to be deployed, because you're not having to deploy a stack that's made by Samsung and that can only transfer data using the Samsung middleware onto the Samsung server type of scenario. So this is to enable the cheaper and practical devices to be deployed. So the work as well that we did as part of Trustable Credit last year was working with the Bunloit estate, which is now part of Highlands Rewilding, and I think Kathy and Penelope are on the call from there. And they really were the first to deploy a wide range of sensors, and we studied that deployment and looked at what the Task Force for Nature-Related Finance Disclosures were demanding in terms of what they were saying about how they view data quality coming from nature projects. And what we concluded in the paper and with the study was that the methods that we were using with the camera traps, and then using apps to create maps about where we'd measured, where measurements had taken place, and how services like Mammal Web had enabled citizen scientists to review and classify the data, that process actually did create the decision grade data that TNFD were looking for. So just to bring a bit more colour to the field trip then at Glen Crippersdale, where we had the opportunity to deploy devices using the sort of version 2, if you like, of the standardised processes for IoT devices and digital measuring devices. This is a picture from the air of the reserve, and this project is also this place is also part of another project that is an IONS funded project, so an investment readiness in nature in Scotland funded project, where we're working out the business model for enabling venture philanthropy using what 3 words maps, but also digital reports, with those digital reports including data generated from the digital devices that we've deployed there. So that project will start in January 2023, and then I've recently been awarded another research project from the Natural Environment Research Council, which will be about following that as a case study, and also following new work that Highlands Rewilding are doing at their next estate, Beldorney, and again, hopefully working in a continued way with Lauriston Farm. So just taking those case studies away from just deploying, establishing baselines, into the next phase where measurements are being, improvement measurements are now being captured, but hopefully the capturing of those following some standardized processes, so that data is considered as decision grade by the finance sector. So a little bit more about that venture philanthropy project then. We'll use what 3 words as a mechanism to encourage us citizens to invest, and then use Avenza maps, use the digital data coming from the deployment of the sensors to be the reward for that investment, to keep people engaged in what they've invested into. So that's the next phase of work at Glen Crippersdale, and we hope that work will be applicable to the wider Alliance for Scotland's Rainforest, and provide a great opportunity to encourage investment in what I've worked out as 300 million metres squared, which would give us 33.3 million what 3 words squares. So imagine if we were able to even gain a figure like £100 each for sponsorship of them. It could really raise some significant funds for the rainforest restoration. So here we are on deployment day, and I don't know if you can see the puddles in the background there, but that just gives you an indication of what the physical deployment day was like. It tipped it down. This is Nick Littlewood from SRUC and Izzy Baker from RSPB, with Izzy's pickup truck, which we really needed to beat the weather, and to give us a dry space to be able to deploy these devices. And the day of deployment was very practical. We were literally putting the devices together out of the box, keeping the instructions organized, using big Sharpie pens to write numbers on the devices, and then kind of going about with our smartphones to take photos of where we'd put devices and how we'd how we'd labeled them. So this is an example of that. We first of all sort of decided on the way that we were going to name the devices as a team. So we decided on GCP to represent Glen Crippersdale. We decided on numbers just to give us reference points against the map, and then to enable us to be able to kind of create records with that numbering system as well. So this is an audio moth. So A is our key for audio moth, and then 10 was the 10th location that we deployed things at. Other things that we did, this is Lucy Mason's beautiful handwriting. She made some habitat notes on the day, and again we'd probably put those in a spreadsheet alongside the location of where we chose to put the sensors. And then we also used Nick's Garmin to give us really precise latitude and longitude location references. We could use the smartphones and the apps for that, but because coverage was quite poor, with 1 or 2 bars of coverage, the Garmin did a better job more quickly of getting the GPS locations locked down. And then just to sort of show how that looks in the Avenza app. So this is just Nick putting in those GPS markers into the map there. So I'm going to stop sharing that kind of quick rattle through what we've done, and just maybe ask Nick or Lucy to reflect on our thinking during that day when we were out in the field. Nick, is there anything else that you want to add in terms of the process that we went through?
No, I mean, it was basically, we had a pre-designed sort of idea of how we wanted to spread things. It was, I guess it was, for want of a better way of putting it, a sort of stratified design for where we were sampling. In very practical terms, the site was a site that had accessibility along the track, but large parts of it were inaccessible due to sort of steepness of terrain and things. And we had an idea of basically trying to sort of stratify things. So we represented the variation in habitat across the site with the devices, so that any change detected would probably hopefully detect, reflect changes in the overall quality of habitat, or changes in the overall sort of cover of different sub-habitat types. Yeah, as Hannah said, it was a very, very wet day, very, very wet couple of days. But I think it was right that we took our time with the deployment. It wasn't a rushed job. We knew that the devices that were going out were going to be out for quite some considerable period of time, so we wanted to get it right in the field, and also, of course, just wanted to get it right in terms of the the quality of the metadata that were collected for for the individual deployments as well.
Great.
And I can't wait to see what we get.
Yeah, I know we're going to go back in March to get the data. Okay, next I'm going to invite Paul Crooks from SAOS and Smart Rural, and Paul is going to show us the standardized process that we've co-created for third-party designers of IoT systems or consultant IoT, a consultant IoT setup business. So Paul, over to you. You do that as Smart Rural, and you've been the mastermind behind this process. So over to you.
Right. Thank you, Hannah. Hello, everyone. My name is Paul Crooks. I'm Principal Operations Engineer at SAOS and Smart Rural. I'm going to attempt to share my screen to show you the flow chart we've made up that shows the perspective of a third party in this process. Where a site manager might be deploying equipment, they may pass that job of setting up the devices to a third party, and that's where we start in our process, where a request from the site manager goes to the third party. And we've tried to categorize and split up the information to be captured that would certify a device as being trustable for delivering trustable data. And they're fairly simple questions from a third party's point of view, or an IoT vendor, for example: model number, log frequency, which is the amount that it will upload and what frequency, whether it's calibrated, power supply. We move on to the device data upload path, which is how is that data being recorded? Is it stored locally only? Is there a method to send that to a cloud database, for example? We move on to data security, which is the device itself secure from malicious intent as well as the data within it? And then we have the data interface, which is information around the site manager, for example, accessing that data in a human user, in a human readable form. There's a break-off point here where a vendor would pass the device along with a pack of information showing all that questions we've just shown to the site manager, but he may want the vendor to carry out that certification themselves. And so we can break off down the path to show just simple questions that a site manager should be asking himself when he receives one of these device document packs. And that is, does the device capture the required metrics he's asked for? If it does, we can pass on. If it doesn't, the device isn't suitable. Is the device physically secured and rugged? And he'll get this information from the questions filled out by the third party, or the third party can certify it themselves. Does the device secure measurement data? Is data encrypted? Are credentials provided? Is passwords provided on the device itself? And is the human user interface adequately protected? So if there are credentials to log into a web page, for example, for looking at that. We've also provided examples of you get USB locks, for example, to stop anyone coming along trying to get data or do anything malicious there. We provided an example, a quick check sheet that a third party could use just to quickly jot down this information, and then the site manager can keep that off to the side as he needs, along with the rest of the document pack he'll be given along with the data, along with the device, sorry. And that, from a third party perspective, our role to play in showing that a device is trustable and the data it provides is trustable too. I'd ask if there's any questions. I think at the end we're going to open this up for others to come into the board and have a closer look at some of the things that are in it.
Yeah, so what thoughts and reflections on that process as a journey for the third party consultants like Paul's company to go through to ensure that devices that they are providing as a package to a site manager are well set up? Any reflections, perhaps?
Anna, it's John. I just wonder if I could ask Paul to describe the audience. So describe the audience for this process, and also to describe what's the skill set of a third party consultant, because I think that speaks to this process in particular, but also the choice to make other processes for other audiences.
So our view as third party here would be an IoT vendor. The likes of ourselves at Smart Rural, we have many customers, clients coming to ourselves saying we need to measure this in this environment, and they haven't a clue of what sensor to pick, and neither should they. That's not their area of expertise. But in years' time, when there are people looking to buy data and they need to ensure that data is trustable, they're going to go back to who sold them the device and ask for this. And if it's not given prior thought beforehand, that information is just not going to be there. By providing an open set of simple questions to capture that data, simple from our perspective as a third party, it makes it easier down the road for the site manager.
Yeah. Davey, could I bring you in at the Hill and Mountain Research Centre? You've received both packages set up by a third party like Smart Rural and deployed sensors yourself. Does this process provide you with the right type of data that you would be looking for from a third party provided service?
And certainly asking the right questions anyway, in terms of what we would want to be aware of, especially going forward. I mean, as we've discussed within the project, and we'll be honest here, I mean, when we started 3 or 4 years ago, we were basically taking what we can get, you know, but as more and more material and sensors come on the market, then it's becoming even more important to be much more aware of many of the questions that are set here along the process path that's been described. So, and even if the question can't be fully answered, at least asking the question and being aware of why you need to ask the question is just as important.
Yeah, and John, Gillies, you can probably reflect back on that around the idea of, you know, even just asking the question, even if you don't know the answer, as why that's important.
Yeah, so there's certainly something around designing something for the audience. And so the assumption is that not all of these will be answered. And if they are answered, they're probably not necessarily going to be answered, if you like, properly or accurately. But the value proposition of the process is about creating awareness. It's about creating a sense of appreciating the risk inherent in having these devices, utilizing them, thinking about the data sets that are involved in it as well. So that's, to me, is the number one value proposition, is the awareness creation. These people that are going to receive this process, especially the one which is imagining that it's not a third party, that it might be somebody in the field, I think they're instantly going to gain an understanding that they probably currently don't have.
Yeah. And Leandro, I don't know if you're still here, but I wonder if I could call on you. If you received evidence that data had been collected through IoT devices through a process like this, would you be assured that the data was trustable?
Hi, sorry for having my camera off. Yeah, I would say so, yes. It sounds quite trustworthy if data was received in this way. It would be super interesting to explore. Yeah, for us in Toy Heroes, we are between the market, private businesses and science, and I think it sounds super fantastic, honestly, and definitely companies would be interested in providing some payment for this.
Yeah, I think that the processes should just be made open access to improve kind of good practice across the sector and improve practice. Obviously, the kind of verification of the data comes at a later stage, really. I suppose this is for project developers, potentially bringing to you a project, but then being able to prove that they've collected the data in this way and that the devices have been handled in this way is what this bit of work is really focusing on. All right, so next, shall we go to John G to present the process that we've designed for site managers, for rangers to be able to deploy. So this is effectively the role that Nick and I played abiliside Izzy and Lucy at RSPB. So it's a bit simpler to view because we're a bit we're humans who just need to follow a simple process rather than a company that needs to kind of provide good practice. So, John, over to you to talk through this.
Sure. Thank you, Hannah. I think, yeah, the first thing is the audience. We're imagining that the audience is somebody in the field. It could be a ranger. It could be a farmer, I guess, potentially as well. They're likely not to be technical. So the assumption here at the beginning, I think, was to try and create a process that captured everything, which is a nice premise. But in doing so, I think that we started to realize that we were thinking about this in our own context as people who already had a technical understanding of these things. So very quickly, at the beginning of writing up these processes, we realized the audience is not us, and therefore, who are they and how do we pitch this to them? So the key thing here is it's unbelievably simplistic, but the key thing also, I think, is by doing that, we're much more likely to capture some information in terms of the process, okay? Excuse me. So very simplistic here. It's asking questions, it's giving options. There are some yeses and nos. There are splits within the process where choices can be made. Ultimately, by going from left to right through the process, the hope is that we capture real data. What we've also done is that we've plugged the process into more practical documentation, such as a spreadsheet that somebody could use in the field and actually fill in cell by cell. And by doing so, effectively map the same data that you would find in this process moving from left to right across the screen. So I'll just briefly go through the process. It's asking here if the IoT device is from a manufacturer that provides regular security updates. So the key thing here is we're trying to encourage almost a buying decision. When you're considering purchase, are you looking at manufacturers that build security into those devices at the point of manufacture? But not just that, that they also continue to provide updates for security going forward. That's really important. I'm kind of wearing my cybersecurity auditor hat when I'm looking at that kind of thing. So it does give options for effectively yes and no. We're then moving on to the authenticity of data. So do we know if this device is calibrated? And if we do, can we collect proof of that? If we know that it's not, do we feel the need to get it calibrated? And so we have the two options again. And ultimately, we want to record the data. So we're also asking, do you have the EUI number of that individual device? Can you record that? Ultimately, what we're building here is an inventory of equipment, locations and the like. And could you get to the point where that inventory is really quite complicated? And if it is, how do you slice and dice the data? So having those individual identifiers that are unique to each device is really important, okay? And then we're looking at setting up and collecting the units that the device outputs. We're looking at recording the manufacturer. We're then looking at splitting out to decide whether this device came from a third-party vendor, and we want to record that if it did. If it didn't, that's okay, and we jump along in the process. We're then looking to record the location and potentially, as Hannah showed in her example from Glen Crippisdale, a photo of that location. We want to make the realization of where things are as real and practical as we can for people. We're going to get latitude, longitude, GPS information about that. We're potentially getting altitude. We're looking at the organization name of the device and the year it was deployed. That speaks to warranty. So some of these devices will have a length of service. Some of them will have some recommendations around maintenance. So potentially what we're looking at here is if we have that data recorded, then it can trigger us to go and look at those kinds of things. Excuse me. We're then looking at configuration settings. So it may be that there is more than one way of configuring the device. So could we take a screenshot of its configuration settings and append that to a spreadsheet or a record? We're looking at the last firmware update date. So again, we're looking to encourage people to be aware of how important that firmware update is. From a security perspective, that's potentially where the hackers can get in, is if you've got something that's 7 or 8 years old, it may have some known vulnerability in place. If you don't do the updates, then it may be that you don't fix the vulnerabilities, okay? Then we're looking at getting that location loaded into something like ArcGIS. Hannah, you were showing a free GIS application. What was that again?
Avenza.
Avenza, yeah. So then we're in a position where you can map those devices and see them on the map. And then we're looking at evidence of data collection or retrieval in terms of the setup. Do they have that or do they not? Again, we have a split in terms of where we can go in the process. And we're looking for them to record the date and reason for data loss if we don't have that information. So we're trying to instill a sense of responsibility in terms of the authenticity of that data record. If you feel that you can't authenticate it, then you need to go through some steps to re-authenticate that data effectively. So we're going back through the process, we're recording the evidence, and we get to a point where we're looking at, okay, we have our data output that connects to some sort of network connection. So that might be 3 or 4G, it might be LoRaWAN, other networks are available. And we want to capture the type of network connection, which we will do. We need to record the network authentication type. That particular part is trying to say to somebody that if there's a higher level of security that can be involved in connecting these devices to the network, then they should try and choose that higher level as the default. So again, these are triggers in terms of raising awareness. And we move on to the next part, where we're looking at the recording of the data store. What kind of data store is this? Is it dashboard-based? Is it web-based? Is it third-party? So we'll look at how to record those. We're looking at whether there's an SD or flash card involved. Have we got the number off that? Do we have individual numbering that we can use to pinpoint that particular device? We're looking at recording the format of that data output. And then we're looking at how is data authenticity verified? Do we have raw data that's going to a database? Maybe ultimately it ends up in an application or a web interface. And the alternative to that is, do we have keychain handshakes? Do we have devices that simply connect up automatically to an existing network, and all of those outputs and pathways are to some extent predetermined? And then we're looking at, does it have encryption at rest? So that's basically if you have a database full of information, if somebody went in, double-clicked it and loaded it up in Notepad, would it all look like gobbledygook? We're hoping that it would. And therefore it's encrypted and very difficult for somebody to utilize that data and take it away. We're also looking at, is the data encrypted in transit? So when the data is sent from a device through the network, for example, is that encrypted during that journey from the device into the network and then ultimately to the graphical interface that somebody's going to interact. And then we're looking at, is the data segregated on the basis of unique user access? So if it's possible to create usernames and passwords, if it's possible to create levels of access around perhaps an administrator at the top, a contributor or editor in the middle, and perhaps somebody at the bottom level who's simply read-only, if that's possible to do, then the recommendation is that you try and do that from the beginning. Because as the complexity rises, as you sort of organically grow your project, then that can then become really difficult to deal with at the end. And then we're looking at administrator access. Is it limited to a necessary group of users? In other words, we don't want everybody who's using these devices to be admin. Actually, we want the polar opposite. We want as few people to be admin as possible. And we want to have some verification of that. Then we're looking at our portable devices, storage devices, sorry, recorded in an approved list and usage limited only to these. So again, if we have things like USB sticks, memory cards, that kind of stuff going on, do we have a list of those? Have we decided that they're of a particular quality? We might decide that we're only going to pick ones that have encryption options on them. Obviously, Paul, you were talking about physically being able to lock such devices. So it's really important to look at that, record them, potentially say to people within that organization that you can only use those approved devices, that no other portable devices ought to be in use. And then we're getting some practical stuff here, guys. We need to recognize people are going to print this stuff out, okay? And in that case, we need to look at some practical clean desk stuff. So what happens when people walk away? Do they leave an awful lot of valuable data hanging around? Because ultimately this could be data that affects financial decisions. Is paper data kept in locked filing cabinets when it's not in use? And ultimately what we want to do is record all of these different aspects of the process in our compliance tracker. So the compliance tracker, just bear with me a moment, guys. Typically I have my menu skewing the top of my browser here. I will do that. We have a compliance tracker that we've created, which is currently in a spreadsheet. We have a CSV output of this tracker. So obviously it can be imported into various other ways of interpreting data. At the moment, Davey, you'll recognize this because what we've got is some dummy data from Kirkton. But the whole point is that this has headings where we wish to capture all of these different data types and these different decisions that we've got in our flowchart, okay? I think the temptation would be to do something slightly groovier in IT speak, but we need to consider the audience and be really, really careful about what we think they can and can't interact with. Guys, please, questions. Very happy to be challenged on that.
Yeah, thank you. And I really appreciate comments from project developers. So Kathy, Penelope, Marion, Jamie.
Don't be shy, guys. Yep, all good, Hannah.
Sorry, no, I was just taking a long time to find the buttons.
Oh, sorry.
No, that's really interesting. Just in terms of when you're talking about this, because obviously there's a big difference, like between, you know, if we're using something like a camera trap, there's the kind of the capturing of the data, and then there's the whole kind of analysis part of it. And I just wondered, you know, this is very much talking about that kind of that raw data capture. Have you also explored that kind of next step of how you take all those clips and identify that that's a roe deer and that's a seeker and things like that? Or is that kind of jumping ahead a bit too far?
Yeah, we haven't got any kind of field tests with data that we've actually collected yet. So that will be in March when we collect the data from the RSPB reserve. But what we did in the paper, Kathy, of course, was use the Bunloit data and then the Bunloit method of mammal web. And that method the sort of citizen science method of classification has been academically verified already as being kind of robust enough in terms of the classification of the data. So this is more about kind of classification of the device and showing, you know, a third-party verifier or, you know, a credit verifier that the device is as trustable as it can be, as well as the, you know, analysis being correct to 97% because we use citizen scientists.
And just, I think Nick touched on the kind of the, you know, having a sensor in kind of each of the main kind of habitat types, but that kind of how representative the areas where you're putting the devices, and also that kind of what density of devices you need, how many devices you need per hectare, whatever. Have you sort of looked into that element as well in terms of the, you know, making sure you've got that robust representation as well as the data you're capturing?
Yeah, that was definitely what we were kind of trying to show at RSPB Glen Cripster, which is sort of very narrow estate, and you know, so we were trying to show, okay, we need sensors in each kind of, you know, ordnance survey map square, but then we also need to cover the different types of habitat, and you know, some sensors are in forests, some are next to coast, some are next to the path. So just sort of thinking about different areas of connectivity as well there.
That's interesting, thank you.
Marion, any thoughts from your perspective? You're thinking about this a lot at the moment.
Yeah, thanks for all of that. God, just looks all ridiculously complicated, but I do understand the need for it. And yeah, I guess, like Kathy, my thoughts were around, actually not, because I'm kind of, yeah, this is not my bag at all in terms of how you, the mechanics and the, you know, the detail of all of how you do all of that verification, but more thinking about, more thinking about how you analyze the data afterwards. So yes, it's one thing collecting it, but then how do you interpret that? And the interpretation for investors might be almost as important as the collection of the data, because it's, you know, it's raw data. What does that actually mean is what they're going to want to understand as well. So yeah, I mean, we're struggling with as well, you know, the sort of statistical methodologies that sit behind how do you analyze it once you've actually got it, yeah, and you verified it. What does it actually mean for investors? And that, in that regard, I suppose it might be useful to think about what this kind of data is likely to be. It's acoustic data, it's photographs, it's maybe water temperatures or air temperatures, and actually the type of analysis that you might have for all of these different kinds of data will be really different. And yeah, so actually how you work that into a system where you get something meaningful out of the end of it, rather than just a shed load of raw data that is very, very difficult to interpret either individually at that point in time, yeah, but also actually understanding the longitudinal nature of that and the trends within that data, which is effectively what we're selling to customers, is that accrual of biodiversity, or the, I don't know, in terms of river temperature, the lower. Yeah,
I think that's what we think the codes will more likely define. So the codes will kind of define the way that the data should be analysed and considered. This is just about kind of ensuring that devices that projects have used on the ground can be considered as trustable data collectors and trustable data measurers.
Yeah.
Would a good split of it possibly be that for the situation where yourselves as, say, a site manager and ourselves as a third party provider, it's our job to make sure you can show that device was a trustable device, was a device that gives trustable data. Like, we can't do the analysis. That's your bag of tricks. And if the person you're selling it to comes back to you, you'll inevitably come to us or check on the document pack we would have given you to say, well, look, you can, if you really want to verify it, you can take it right from point 0 and go right the way through to when we give you the analysis, and you'll get the same answers. And I think that kind of shows what we're trying to aim at with our flow charts, and still try and leave it open enough for all, like you're saying, the locations that could go in, the types of sensors that could be, the types of analysis that it needs to be done.
I think the thing is, the data analysis applies algorithms, decisions, mathematics to that acquired data that comes from the devices in the first place. And therefore, that process is only as good as the authenticity of the acquired data. And so it's about just trying to point the gun at that problem in the first instance, I suppose, and get some process around that, I guess, just to make it work better.
Great. Simon, you've got a thought.
Yeah, just wonder whether a couple of questions as part of the process, around permissions. So around who owns the data. I guess I'm thinking about, ensuring that there's ultimately transparency around the data being collected. So that's one. The other one is about, I suppose, along with security, just the reliability of the device as well.
And ultimately, I guess that's on our side of things to, if they come to us, for example, is for us to try and select the most appropriate sensor. And I guess if the site manager doesn't feel he is competent enough to validate the information provided, he could go to another assessor, like John, for example, to check that off and just make sure it's okay. And then, quite rightly come back to us if it's not and say, like, this is wrong. This isn't going to do for the situation it's going into.
Yeah, I think there's something here, Leandra, I think, about other industries as well, where we can learn about other approaches. And Paul, you're obviously a company that sells into the oil and gas sector, for example, where this kind of data acquisition is a little more mature. But obviously, if you think about the sheer money involved in getting that data right in that industry, then the pressure on all parts of the process is much higher. So it's just, I think, starting with the basics in terms of what we're looking at here first, which then give us permission to become a little bit smarter as the process matures. It's not an event, this process, it's a sort of ongoing organic thing that we'll learn over time,
Good, thanks, John. So thank you everybody for your time. Our hour has come up, but thanks ever so much for your reflections on this very, very narrow bit of, how do we create trustable credits using digital devices and data. So this section has just been about assuring the trustability of the digital devices, and we really appreciate your inputs and thoughts today.
Thank you, Hannah and team. I certainly think, although we're calling it narrow, it's really excellent to hear about this detail, to really practically enable IoT sensors to come to bear on this market. So I think this is incredibly powerful work. And if people want to receive a copy of the presentation, I'm sure Hannah will be able to oblige. I'll certainly put a copy of the presentation on the Pioneers Basecamp, and also make the recording of today's session available to anyone who isn't available here but is on the Pioneers.
Great.